The real explosion happened at Thanksgiving, when my mother lifted her glass and said, "So, Ava, when are you finally getting married?" Everyone laughed until I answered, "I already did, 6 months ago." Silence, sharp enough to cut through the candles between us. My father stopped mid-slice. My uncle stared. My sister Marissa didn't look up at all. Too still, too careful. "You all got invitations," I added. That was when the room shifted, like everyone suddenly realized there was a secret sitting between us, one only I seemed willing to touch. And here's the part they didn't know yet. Someone made sure those invitations never reached them. Before I unravel how my own sister erased my wedding from existence, if you enjoy real-life family drama and moments where long-buried truths finally break open, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. My name is Ava Morgan, I'm 29, and to understand how everything went so wrong that night, you need to know how quietly my life had finally started to go right. 5 years earlier, I left Portland for Boulder, Colorado, taking a job studying watershed data. Nothing flashy, nothing impressive to the people who used to judge me by comparison to Marissa, but meaningful to me. I lived in a red brick apartment overlooking the foothills, with sunlight that spilled into the room before I was ready for it, and notebooks full of measurements and sketches piled on the kitchen table. My life was small, steady, and mine. Then I met Noah Hale, a carpenter with patient eyes and a laugh that reminded me how simple kindness could feel. His family welcomed me like I'd always belonged, without asking me to audition for a role. His mother remembered the details of my job. His father brought me old maps he thought I'd love. They didn't perform closeness, they lived it. And somewhere in the middle of all that warmth, I realized something I'd never learned at home. I didn't have to fight to be seen, which is why the betrayal, the missing invitations, the signatures, the silence, cut so deep when the truth finally surfaced. In the weeks after that unsettling silence from my family, life in Boulder continued with its usual calm, but there was a faint tension hovering beneath everything, subtle enough to ignore at first, yet persistent enough that it followed me through my days like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. I would be measuring stream levels or reviewing satellite images, and some small part of my mind would drift back to the same question. Why hasn't anyone said anything? My engagement wasn't a minor announcement. It was the kind of news families usually rush to celebrate, but mine didn't rush. They didn't even walk. They simply stayed silent. It started with little things. My mother letting my call ring through without replying. My father responding to a text with a brief, "We'll talk soon," that stretched into days without follow-up. And Marissa viewing my engagement photo but scrolling past it as if it belonged to a stranger. At first, I told myself I was reading too much into it. People were busy, schedules didn't align, maybe the news landed during a chaotic week. But the quiet didn't pass. It settled. And as it settled, it changed shape. 2 weeks went by with no congratulations from anyone, not even a curious question. It felt strangely deliberate, as though my announcement had slipped into a void. By the 3rd week, doubt had begun to press against me in a more urgent way. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table late at night, my laptop open, scrolling through sent mail and tracking numbers, not because I believed I'd made a mistake, but because silence has a way of creating cracks, even in the sturdiest confidence. The invitations were sent exactly as planned, addressed properly, mailed early, signature required. I had monitored the tracking updates like a ritual, refreshing them every few hours during those early days of planning. The data was solid, the packages were delivered, they were received. Yet no one reacted. That contradiction, the certainty of delivery and the absence of response, became the quiet engine driving my unease. It didn't roar, it hummed steadily, insistently, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, while Noah stirred a pot on the stove, I sat staring at the tracking page again. The delivered status glowed confidently across all 4 entries. When Noah finally asked what I was looking for, I told him the truth. softly, almost embarrassed at how much space it had taken up in my mind. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't tell me I was overthinking. Instead, he watched me for a moment, then said, "If something feels off, it usually is." "What do you think happened?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that without a layer of judgment. The question landed with unexpected weight, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. But then the instinct I'd been pushing away rose to the surface, the instinct shaped by years of being overshadowed. "I think someone got them," I said slowly. "Someone who wasn't supposed to." Noah didn't argue. He just nodded, like he'd reached the same conclusion. That night, after he went to shower, I sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, replaying years of small incidents, moments I'd brushed off because acknowledging them felt too confrontational. Times mail had mysteriously gone missing, times plans shifted without my knowledge, times Marissa had forgotten to pass something along and always had an excuse ready. None of those moments had felt big on their own, but together they formed a pattern, one I had refused to name. The tension inside me, once a faint vibration, had grown into something more defined, something with shape and direction. I could feel it gathering, quiet but determined, leading me toward an answer I wasn't sure I wanted. And then, sometime past midnight, while the apartment was still and the mountains outside my window were nothing but dark outlines, the realization finally crystallized. The silence wasn't accidental. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was curated. Someone had made a choice. And deep down, beneath the hurt and confusion, I already knew who that someone was. I closed the laptop with a slow, steady breath. Something was wrong, seriously wrong, and the truth was no longer hiding. It was waiting. Once the idea took root, that someone might have intercepted the invitations, the air around me seemed to shift in a subtle but unmistakable way, as if the quiet certainty I'd been trying to ignore had finally decided to speak in a voice I could no longer pretend not to hear. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, a steady unwinding of denial that began with a simple, almost reluctant decision. I needed to see the proof for myself. Not opinions, not guesses, not emotions. Proof. So one night, after Noah had fallen asleep with the soft glow of a lamp still reflected on his shoulder, I opened my laptop again and returned to the tracking records. I'd seen the delivered status countless times before, but this time I clicked deeper, following a link I had previously overlooked, a digital confirmation containing a copy of the recipient's signature. I expected a scribble, something rushed or generic, but when the scanned document filled the screen, my breath stilled. There, looping confidently across the bottom of the page, was a name I recognized instantly. Marissa. Not Mom, not Dad, not my uncle. Her. A part of me had been preparing for it, yet the reality still landed with the weight of something irreversible. For a long moment I didn't move. I simply stared at the signature, the familiar curve of the M, the way she always added a small flourish to her final A, a habit she developed in high school when she discovered that even her handwriting could earn compliments. Something about seeing it there, in a place it never should have been, opened a quiet ache across my chest. I clicked on the next confirmation, then the next, and again. Every single signature belonged to her. No variety, no alternation, no trace of anyone else in that household even touching those envelopes. She hadn't intercepted something casually. She had handled it methodically, intentionally, as if she believed herself entitled to filter my life the same way she filtered every other piece of information that moved through that house. When Noah walked into the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he paused at the sight of me, rigid, unmoving, illuminated only by the cold light of the screen. He approached without speaking, sat beside me, and waited until I tilted the laptop toward him. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he read, not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had been expecting this moment even before I allowed myself to. This wasn't a mistake, he murmured. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. What now? He asked. The question lingered, not as pressure, but as permission. Permission to look deeper. Permission to stop shrinking from what my instincts had been trying to tell me. Permission to confront the truth even if it hurt. I wasn't ready to confront Marissa or my parents, not yet, but I was ready to confront the data. So we opened the family email account, the one my parents never used except for group messages and the occasional bill reminder, the one Marissa managed because she insisted it was too complicated for them. Navigating through old folders felt strangely intimate, like stepping into a storage closet filled with forgotten moments, but eventually we found the activity log. There it was, a timestamp, April 22nd, 10:14 a.m., wedding announcement, opened. Wedding announcement deleted. Wedding announcement permanently removed. The device ID didn't match my parents' phones or their outdated desktop computer. Instead, it corresponded to a tablet registered years earlier under the nickname M's Slate, a name playful enough to sound harmless, but now hollowed by what it represented. A heaviness settled over me, not explosive but dense and unavoidable. It wasn't just that she had hidden my invitations. It was that she had erased every trace of them with the same casual entitlement she'd used all our lives to make decisions on behalf of everyone, especially me. I felt the weight of old memories stir. Times mail disappeared, times plans changed, times I was excluded and told it was an oversight. I had carried each moment alone, never wanting to believe they meant anything, but they meant everything. Noah rested a hand gently on my back, grounding me, but the truth had already carved its own space inside me. This wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about forgetfulness. It was about control, about preserving her narrative as the center of our family's attention, even if it meant removing me completely. I closed the laptop slowly, the hinge clicking like the end of a quiet ceremony. I can't pretend anymore, I said softly. You don't have to, Noah replied. Thanksgiving was approaching, and for the first time in my life, I felt something unfamiliar rising. Not fear, not anger, but resolve. I had spent years stepping carefully around the edges of my family's dynamic, bending myself into versions that took up less space, less oxygen, less attention, but not this time. I'm going home, I said, my voice steady, almost calm. And this time, I'm not walking in blind. Noah nodded, his expression a mix of pride and worry, but he knew, just as I did, that once the truth begins to surface, it demands to be seen, and I was finally ready to stop disappearing. Thanksgiving arrived with the kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp, as though the world itself is bracing for something. Noah offered to come with me, twice, but I knew I needed to walk into that house alone, not because I wanted to face them without support, but because some truths are too personal to be softened by another presence. There are moments when you must carry your own history to the table and set it down where everyone can finally see it. The Morgan house looked the same as always, wreath on the door, lights strung carefully along the porch, windows glowing with the soft amber tint my mother preferred. Yet the moment I stepped inside, a familiar tension swept over me. A hush beneath the chatter, a weight beneath the warmth. I had grown up in this atmosphere, trained to ignore it, trained to smile through it, but now it pressed against me with a clarity I couldn't unfeel. My mother was in the kitchen arranging herbs over the turkey as if preparing a stage set, narrating details of Marissa's upcoming reception to two aunts, who nodded obligingly. My father poured wine for guests in the living room, offering polite smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Marissa, of course, stood near the fireplace laughing lightly as her husband adjusted the sleeve of her dress like she was the centerpiece of a holiday advertisement. No one looked at me with the warmth families usually reserve for someone returning home. No one asked about the engagement. No one asked how I'd been. Their silence wasn't absence. It was choreography. I took a seat at the dining table directly across from Marissa. She didn't meet my eyes, though I saw the faint stiffening in her posture when she realized exactly where I had chosen to sit. It was the kind of tension that reveals itself only to those who've lived beside it long enough to understand its dialect. Dinner began with the usual script. Praise for Marissa's wedding dress, the imported flowers she was considering, the number of guests they somehow kept raising as if attendance equated to virtue. I listened quietly, feeling each word scrape against the truth I carried inside me. Every mention of her wedding felt like a reminder, not of celebration, but of erasure. At some point between the salad and the main course, my father finally glanced in my direction. There was something uncertain in his eyes, as if he sensed a shift he couldn't quite name. "How's Boulder?" he asked, his tone gentle but distant, like he was speaking to a neighbor he vaguely recognized rather than his daughter. "It's good," I replied. "Work's been meaningful." He nodded, but the moment dissolved almost immediately as Marissa's husband launched into a story about their photographer, and the attention swung back toward the place it always landed, her. The escalation inside me didn't come as anger, it came as clarity. The more I watched them, my mother tilting her head toward Marissa as if awaiting cues, my father choosing silence over involvement, my aunts offering hollow admiration, the more I felt the line between what I used to tolerate and what I now knew split wider. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't oversensitive. The patterns I'd spent years excusing were all unfolding right in front of me, like a script they'd rehearsed by heart. I caught Marissa watching me once, not directly, but in the way someone monitors something fragile they're afraid might crack. There was no guilt in her expression, no uncertainty, only calculation, as though she were assessing whether I intended to disrupt her spotlight. And that was the moment the shift happened. Not an explosion, not a confrontation, a decision. I realized I didn't need them to ask about my wedding. I didn't need them to acknowledge their absence. I didn't need their warmth, their approval, or their carefully engineered affection. What I needed was to tell the truth, to place it gently, unmistakably in the center of the table where it couldn't be dismissed or swept aside. So when my mother tapped her spoon against her glass, drawing the room's attention the same way she had since we were children, and praised Marissa's incredible September wedding, before turning toward me with that perfectly rehearsed smile and asking, "So, Ava, when will we get to celebrate yours?" I felt the room contract around me, felt every conversation fall away, felt the exact moment the air shifted. And for the first time in my life, I didn't swallow the hurt. I didn't smooth it over. I didn't shrink. The truth rose inside me with quiet certainty, and I knew that what happened next would change everything. I don't think anyone at that table understood how profoundly the room shifted when my mother asked her question, but I felt it with absolute clarity, like standing at the edge of a lake just before a storm breaks its surface. There was no drama in her voice, no malice she would ever admit to. She asked it the same way she always asked questions meant to place me back into the shadows, lightly, politely, as though the answer didn't matter. "So, Ava, when will your big day be?" The irony was almost laughable. Almost. I set my fork down, not with anger but with the precision of someone choosing their moment. The small clink against the plate echoed louder than it should have, drawing eyes toward me. Marissa shifted slightly, the way someone does when they sense a script slipping out of their hands. "I already had mine," I said. The stillness that followed was so complete it felt engineered. My mother's smile faltered first, the corners dropping as though she'd misheard me. My father paused mid-slice, the knife hovering above the turkey. Conversations froze in mid-air. "You... what?" my mother asked, her voice tightening. I kept my gaze steady. 6 months ago, in June." The silence didn't crumble. It hardened. I watched it travel across the table, watched the confusion collide with something darker, watched Marissa's posture go rigid, her fingers curling slightly around her napkin. "We never received an invitation," my father said slowly, each word chosen with a caution that bordered on pleading. "I know," I replied, and the room inhaled collectively. I reached into my bag, not hurriedly, not theatrically, and pulled out my phone. The screen's glow reflected in the silverware as I opened the tracking records, the sequence of deliveries, each stamped, signed, and documented with a precision no one could dispute. "I sent 4 invitations to the house," I said, my voice calm in a way that felt entirely new. "All delivered, all signed for." My mother leaned forward, her breath catching when she saw the first signature. My father adjusted his glasses as if the truth depended on clarity of vision. Across the table, Marissa stared straight ahead, her stillness a confession of its own. I swiped to the next confirmation, then the next. Each signature belonged to her. "Marissa signed for all of them," I said. The collective gasp wasn't loud. It was fragmented, uncertain. The kind of disbelief people cling to when the truth disrupts the hierarchy they've lived in for years. My mother shook her head, a reflexive denial born more from habit than reason. My father looked at Marissa with a confusion that bordered on betrayal. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I must have forgotten to—" "You didn't forget," I said gently, and the gentleness carried more weight than accusation ever could. "You deleted the email announcement too." The final reveal landed like a quiet earthquake. No shaking, no shouting, just the undeniable shift in the room as something long concealed broke into daylight. For years, I had shouldered the erasures, the small silences, the invisible rearrangements of reality that always seemed to tilt in her favor. But now, the truth lay on the table beside the untouched wine glasses, unavoidable, undeniable, and finally, irrevocably mine to speak aloud. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking to be believed. I was simply being heard. In the days that followed, my family tried to rewrite the moment in a dozen different ways. Softened versions, revised intentions, explanations that arrived too late to hold any weight. But something fundamental had shifted inside me at that Thanksgiving table. Something I didn't know had been waiting so long to move. I had spent years offering grace without receiving any, years trying to belong in a place that only welcomed the version of me that didn't take up too much space. Speaking the truth didn't break my family. It simply revealed where the fractures had already been. What surprised me most wasn't the fallout. It was the peace that came afterward. A quiet, steady knowing that I had finally chosen myself. Healing, I've learned, doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like walking away, standing taller, and letting the silence that follows belong to you for the first time. Family isn't defined by who shares your blood. It's defined by who refuses to let you disappear. That is the sentence I carried with me into my new life, and it's the one that still anchors me today. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for giving stories like mine a place to land. If this resonated with you, or reminded you of something you've lived through, I hope you'll stay, comment, or share your own experience. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, filled with truth, resilience, and the courage it takes to rise again, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps this community grow in ways that truly matter. I'll see you in the next video.